Hello, everyone. Very excited to welcome you all to the Investment, Impact, and Finance session here in LS3. I'm very excited to welcome Chris Crothers with us today. He is the Director of Impact Investment and the Senior Program Officer at Jessie Ball duPont Fund, a national grant-making private foundation. At duPont Fund, Chris works with investment managers, the president and trustee to maintain and carve out the fund's endowment that demonstrates positive impact and alignment, when possible, with the fund's grant objectives. Chris has over 19 years of experience in the independent sector and philanthropy and is a proud 2017 Career Pathways alum. We're very lucky and happy to have you with us. Hi, Chris.
Hi, well, thanks for having me today.
You're very welcome. All right, so let's dive deep into it. And so something unique about you that I'm very excited that you're bringing to the LS3 is that you wear two hats within your organization, the grant making side and the finance and investment side. I'm curious to hear about how you bring in those two hats to the work that you do.
Sure. So it is a little unique that I'm coming from the grant making world into the finance side of the house. And I think it's fair to say that historically, it's been a house divided, right? Foundations are basically financial instruments to try and drive change in the world, but at the end of the day, they are financial instruments. So you have folks who are dedicated and very passionate about the finance side and ensuring that the corpus is growing so that folks can do more grant making. But it's somewhat rare, I would say, especially in intermediate and smaller foundations, that those finance folks have insight into exactly how the foundation is trying to create change, by what methods, what activities, how the program team functions, what their needs are specifically. So it's been very interesting kind of moving from the program side into finance and having conversations specifically with advisors who really have that kind of tunnel vision around maximizing income and revenue for their clients. But when you start having some deeper conversations about impact, I really have been shocked that we don't speak the same language in a lot of cases, right? Impact to them is a little bit different than the impact that I would talk about as a program officer and a grant maker. So it's been an interesting journey over the last several years to try and bridge both of those worlds. And it's been a learning curve on my end specifically, but as a client to some of one of the larger advisors out there, it's been a learning journey for them as well to try and begin to start talking a different language and having different objectives and metrics kind of added to the work that they didn't have before.
Oh, that's wonderful, Chris. I hear you say it's sort of humanizing the investment and the finance area of work, right? Because it's so easy to see the numbers and then wanting to keep profit up. But this is so much also around, that's what makes us different from corporates and other different organizations, is the work that you do on the ground. And it's so great that you're able to bring in both of those areas. So I think that goes in perfectly to our next section around, well, so if a new CEO were to enter an organization or an executive were to enter an organization, how should one look at investment and finance and this work in this area of work that you do now in a different way, maybe that, other folks may have thought about it?
Well, I think anybody that's willing to step into the role of a CEO, that position, and kind of to lead an organization probably has to have a functional understanding of finance and investments. And so I said earlier, a foundation is primarily a financial vehicle that's driving mission. So I think a basic understanding of investment and finance is important. I don't think it is ultimately critical as far as a skill set for an incoming CEO. I think that when I think about things, I look at foundations kind of on a spectrum. And it depends a lot on the culture of the organization and the type of organization that one might step into. So that spectrum might look like, on one side, you may have a foundation that's really focused on maximizing their corpus. So they're going to develop their board in such a way to where they're bringing on financial experts and investment experts, or they're expanding subcommittees to be able to bring these investment experts on so that they come in and do some of the heavy lifting, or may do some of the heavy lifting along with an advisor, so that they're really trying to maximize the amount of grant capital that's going to be available for the organization. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have what I would call the do-gooders, right? And those are foundations that are really hyper, sensitive and critical about their mission. So they may develop their board in a much different way, to where they're bringing on like community experts, for instance. So if you're a foundation that cares deeply about creating change in urban environments, you very well may have a board that's that might take the seats of some of these other investment folks, might be community voices, that nonprofit leaders or leaders in the community that really care about the outcomes and understand the work that you're doing. So to me, there's that spectrum between strong finance and then strong mission, and then people and organizations fall somewhere along that spectrum. I would say that an incoming CEO that might be stepping into a foundation that has that strong investment background, there's probably not a stronger need to have that investment and finance background on the part of the CEO. I think that, though, if you're stepping in on the opposite side of the spectrum that is much more mission focused, it's very helpful to kind of have that background and understanding, because you very well may be one of the strongest voices in the room that needs to understand the finance side. Again, it's the fuel driving the mission. So, as one of the strong leaders in the room, I think it's super important to understand the workings of an endowment, how to invest. And then again, as we start to move into our conversation about impact investing, they very well may have to be the torchbearer for that work, because it's been my experience that not all boards are initially receptive to the idea of impact investing. So somebody has to kind of carry that conversation along and bring an organization along. Sometimes that falls squarely on the shoulders of the CEO.
Wow, no, that's really interesting. So it's really about understanding all the areas of it, right? And finding balance within what you're saying, this maximum purpose work and the do-gooders. I wrote my little chart down. That's really interesting. And so you mentioned a bit about it, but I would love to go deeper into what you were talking about with impact investing, and how could we work, how can an organization advance their strategy with impacting or investing or finance or the mission?
Well, if you think about private foundations specifically, I don't pick on private foundations, and we're a moderate sized private foundation. We use 5% of the assets at our disposal to do our work. So IRS says we have to spend 5% so that we can, in grant making or supportive grants, then that's what most folks do. And then the 95% is invested elsewhere, again, to try and grow the corpus so that we can, incrementally increase that little wedge, that 5% of grant making, and hopefully it gets a little bit bigger over time. I like to say that 5% of our endowments do 100% of the work in most foundations. And I think when you think about how does it complement your grant making strategy, well, it's like if you can bring some of that 95% to the table, right, and complement and support what you're trying to do with your grant making. And I'll use affordable housing as an example. Affordable housing is an expensive endeavor. And for, again, for a moderate sized foundation like the Jessie Ball duPont Fund, we could easily absorb all of our grant dollars just in affordable housing, just in one city, and still barely move the needle, right? It's complex. There are different capital stacks. But we could possibly use our grant making around providing incentives, expanding technical assistance to CDCs and CDFIs, and then use our corpus for the high dollar investments, whether it's investing in acquisition of property or paying off a perm loan or whatever that might be in the capital stack, we could actually invest in those pieces of the puzzle and drive change. So to me, it's using that 95%, taking some of it off of Wall Street and then putting it on Main Street in some cases, because you can have a much higher impact in place if you're stepping into or leaning into your endowment and that 95% and bringing more capital to the table, especially for local programs. It could be a game changer.
Wow, that's really interesting. May I ask a little bit more around that? And so how would someone maybe entering an organization or an executive and is interested in doing that, bringing a little bit more of that 95%, how could someone go about that? Or is there some preparation that as you're preparing to become a CEO or an executive in your institution, and that's something you're passionate about, what could one do to prepare to be able to create that sort of strategy at an organization?
Well, I think, again, some of the strategy around investment is growing from our grant making. And again, I'll use affordable housing as an example. So it's something we care deeply about. There's an affordable housing crisis in each one of the communities that we serve. So it definitely was on our radar. I think the advice I could possibly give folks that might be stepping into it, whether you're super experienced in finance and understand it, or you're a novice, I think that there's one way that I would recommend to kind of step into that space. And that would be to use your endowment and lend it to a CDFI, a community development financial institution. You could set up a long-term patient capital loan with an organization like a CDFI that's an expert with dealing with affordable housing developers, small businesses, providing technical assistance. And what you're doing is contributing loan capital to expand the number of loans or increase the number of deals that can happen in your community. From my perspective, and I think many's perspective, they're very low risk in that these CDFIs are pretty well established. Many of them aren't necessarily depository institutions like a traditional bank, but they have loan loss reserves. From my vantage point, I consider them very, very low risk from that perspective. And when I'm having a conversation with trustees who may be resistant to risk, those are the sort of deals that really kind of greased the wheel for us, that really helped open the door. Because once we started making a few of these, and I was able to come back and report, oh, well, let me tell you about the number of affordable units had been created. And then we could say, and this was for 30% average median income or 80% average median income, or these number of units were reserved for folks that may have had physical or intellectual disabilities. We start seeing this impact in our own backyard, and it really made the trustees kind of excited. They were hungry for more. So we expanded that work. And then, of course, as we expanded that work over time, then folks started to say, well, maybe we should take on a little more risk. The conversation, we were able to do parallel tracks. We were able to do the work in kind of a low risk way. But then we were having the conversation along the way about what is the role of the foundation and what are the values of our foundation. And if we really care about community change, deep community change, and we believe that to some extent we see philanthropic capital as social venture capital, then we should be able to absorb more risk than most other folks in the community, and it can be very catalytic. So it was an interesting conversation for us, kind of driving down that parallel road to be able to get to where we are now, where we're saying, oh, well, yeah, wow, we need to do this. This is absolutely something we should be in, and it's so important. Maybe we're not going to even get a return on it. Maybe we'll offer a 0% interest loan, or maybe it'll be a guarantee that will be there. We don't have to fund it right now, but we'll be there in case something goes sideways. But the work is so important, and the impact's going to be so important that if we weren't at the table, maybe the deal wasn't going to happen.
Oh, incredible. We need to take the risk. That's our job, right? And that's our role within philanthropy, to be able to be the risk takers for the community members, because they don't have a lot of people that are willing to make those risks for them. And so that's incredible. Thank you for going a bit more into that, because I was really curious about that. So I think it goes I would love to get more into what we all are so passionate about and what's such a huge pillar with career pathways equity. So there's so many ways in where equity could lead in and can be used within finance. So I would love to hear from your perspective. How can one create equity within an institution, and that can be advanced equity and with through the mission or through investment or through finance.
So I would say, I'll talk a little bit about how we're trying to advance equity outside of our institution using our endowment, just to put a finer point on that. When you think about the financial market in which we work, right? I think there's close to $80 trillion that's invested globally through fund managers and the like. Only 1.3% of that, say, $80 trillion is actually owned or managed by firms that are woman or person of color owned. And of course, everybody knows population demographics, and that percentage does not jive at all with what we see in our communities. The finance industry is predominantly white male led. And there's no other way to say it. It is what it is. And the problem that we run to in that scenario, especially with some boards, you have some boards that really fall back on their fiduciary duty as maximizing the revenue for the institution, maximizing the investment. And it's the way things have always been done. It's the structure. Right? It's like, oh, well, of course we've got to go with these guys. They make a lot of money, and that's kind of what we have to do. It's my duty as a trustee or a board member to do that. If I fail, then I'm not doing my job. The challenge that we have, that a lot of board members and a lot of investment folks don't really understand, I think, is that white men have tapped out their market. Right? Who else are they going to invest in? There is nothing in their sphere of influence or connectivity that's new or different. I mean, basically, we already have what we've already got with, that we can expect from white male-led institutions. Where the change and the catalyst happens is when we start looking at providing opportunity to folks who have been historically excluded, right? The markets that haven't had capital. That's the new frontier. So, we can't rely on the old guard to get us where we need to go. So we need to take that 1.3% and start increasing it drastically, because what will happen is then those fund managers that now control the money will look at enterprises within their sphere of influence and their networks, which are going to look a lot different than the old guards. And capital is going to start driving to entrepreneurs and smaller enterprises, predominantly in communities of color, woman-led, and it's going to open up new markets and new capital markets that we haven't actually been able to tap into and maximize. So I think if you kind of stay to the status quo, you're really not maximizing your endowment like you think you are. Right? You might be doing pretty well, but it's my theory, and I think there's a few other folks out there that believe that a larger market driving capital is, to areas where it normally doesn't flow. It's the next step, and it's what we need to be doing, and that's where foundations come in. The work that we're leading now, I'm purposely putting KPIs, key performance indicators, just around diversity in our carve out. And then we're expanding that beyond just the carve out for impact into the full endowment. So I could say right now, out of the 17 million that we have invested in what I would call super high impact investments, today we're at 66% of those investments are invested in organizations that are woman or BIPOC led or owned, as well as organizations that are intentionally driving capital into underserved markets. Now that's just a slice of the portfolio. Then we have an ESG carve out, that ESG, environmental and social governance, kind of index funds. I consider those as not high impact, but maybe do no harm. right? We're not investing in the bad players, but it's really hard to show direct impact through some of these indexed funds. About 33% of those are directed toward diverse. And then we get into the traditional endowment that is being basically solely led by an advisor. We get to like 6%. We see a big drop off in the number and the percentage of diversity amongst the portfolio. So overall, if you do just a blend of diversity on our portfolio, I think we're roughly about 18.6%, with the anticipation of growing to get closer to population demographics is our ultimate goal. I don't know how long it'll take us to get there, but I really do believe that driving the capital and holding ourselves accountable as stewards of this money, and especially if, we say that we espouse equity in our work and our grant making, and I think it's realistic that we should also do it in our investments.
That's wonderful. No, I mean, that's exactly it. You can't walk the walk. I mean, you can't speak if you're not walking the walk. And that means really being thoughtful around the investments that you're making back into the community, because that's, to your point, a huge part of the work. Yeah.
Well, if you're using 5%, I'll just use this analogy. It's like if just in typical impact investing, we won't necessarily talk about diversity in this example, but if you make you give a nickel out of a dollar for a grant, let's say it's to a healthcare organization or community health work. If you take that one nickel out of that dollar and you put it towards improving community health, but you turn around, you take the 95 cents and you invest in index funds that are full of tobacco companies, for instance, you have just erased, not just erased, you have just decimated that little bit of grant dollar that you were able to put in that community. You just eroded it completely, making your overall work somewhat ineffective. So I think looking at it and going through your holdings to understand what you own. There's that adage that you keep hearing about impact investing, know what you own. That's like one of the first steps. You get an understanding of what you own, you understand the values and the mission of what you're trying to achieve through your work, and then you start going through and hopefully getting rid of the stuff that's working against your grant making. And if you're working in the equity space, you're doing much of the same things, right? So for instance, we care a lot about inclusive and equitable economies. So if we're invested in some, if you follow the money, and ultimately we're invested in some group that's doing predatory lending, and we'll use like fintech as an example. That's an easy example now that people could be easily invested in and not have any understanding or idea that these companies are stripping wealth out of communities. You could easily own these companies, and if you don't know any better, if you don't do the work to understand it, if you're doing equity grant making in your community, but you're investing 95% in these other firms, you're stripping all that good work away that you've been doing. And it's really opened my eyes years ago to the importance of how you manage and how you place your money, how you want your money to show up in the world.
That's our power here, our money. That's why, philanthropy is what it is. It's the power of money. Oh, so much. So I could hear and ask you so many questions, but I did promise that we would stay within our time for the recording for folks, and so they could have time to ask you questions in the Jamboard. And so I'm just going to go over a couple big things that I heard you say throughout, which were really impactful for me. You talked a lot about what I hear about pushing outside the box of the status quo in your words, of really being able to think thoughtfully around financial officers should have expertise about the community and grant making and all that. So then when you're in the room and having those conversations, it goes bigger than just just the money, but also how the money is being used and how it aligns back to the mission and the work that the organizations are committing to. Expanding past that 25% and pushing to try to get as much out of that 25% as we can, and how we can do that, and diversifying the portfolio as well, and how you can think more critically and thoughtful and intentionally about what communities it's going to. And what you said, the value right now is in BIPOC and women-owned organizations and how we're giving the money back to that. But I really like what you said at the end as well around the investment is such an important and crucial part of an organization, and we shouldn't separate that out from all the other work that we're doing. And so if an organization's truly committed to equity and doing a work within the community, your investments should align as much as your grant making with that mission and values that the organization is committing to. So those were a few big things. I think you said a lot, but those are a huge couple things that stood out to me that I wanted to highlight as we wrap up here. But Chris, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to tell the group, advice or anything that you would give to the this year's cohort?
No, if it's anything like the 2017 cohort, I know they are in outstanding hands. I still look back fondly at my time and my experience there, and the work, our capstone work that we did is something I still refer to all the time and share with folks, especially when I'm trying to bring them into the fold for impact investing. It's something that I fall back on, and the connections that I've made have been incredible and have really helped me along, my journey. So I'm excited about the path that folks are on, and hope y'all have, as good or better experience than what I had. And no doubt that they will.
Thank you so much, Chris. All right, everyone. So you're just going to take a couple minutes now to fill out the Jamboard. We have a slide ready to ask questions to Chris. We're going to give those questions to Chris in the next few days after you submit your questions, and then Chris will get back to us with his responses. But thank you all so much for this. Thank you, Chris, so much for this space. It's been wonderful learning. We'll have his information on the LMS if you have any more questions or want to chat directly to Chris about impact investing, finance, and all the work that he does at DuPont Fund. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.